You sit at the porthole and catch the usual jolt. Acceleration is always like a short sprinter's start. Noisy, powerful, predictable. It's a long day, like the morning, with work, meetings, and plans ahead. Everything is on schedule, and suddenly, like a knife through the ribbon of habit, the nose of the plane rises, but the body rests against the ground. Instead of a light hop, there are thuds as if someone is hitting the metal floor with a sledgehammer from inside. The tail slashes the concrete, sparks pour out from under it, like rain on the contrary. Where the routine should be quiet, the wheezing and coughing of turbines appears. Not the music of speed, but a ragged, nervous party when the air enters the wrong way. The backs of the chairs are pressing into the backs. The straps seem to be getting thinner, and time is getting thicker. Now you have seconds to live, a phrase that usually only sounds in movies, suddenly becomes physics. The cabin is shaking. The commander has a steering wheel in his hands, which warns not with words, but with vibration, too close to the edge. The stick shaker shakes the control speakers like an alarm clock that cannot be turned off. If water is a symbol of tranquility, then now the plane is like a board on the crest of a wave. A little higher, it will tear off. A little lower, it will cover. For passengers, it's just pitching and fire from behind. For aerodynamics, it's a lack of lift. The wing asks for speed and area, but gets a thin profile and slow flow. The contrast hurts the ear. Outside, there's a millimeter-long system, lane markings, course glide path antennas, speed markings. Inside, there's human haste, nerves, and the feeling that we will make it. One world lives by Bernoulli's formula and angles of attack, the other by assumptions and memory. Ideally, they match. Not right now. The wheels do come off, but this is the kind of breakaway that stubbornly refuses to turn into a normal climb. The pitch angle increases, the air goes under the wing in a different jet than the engineers expected, and one console suddenly gives less lift than the other. Roll to the right, and the tip of the wing scratches the concrete, leaving behind a glowing dotted line. The commander levels up. Instinct says hold your nose. Physics responds slow down. Engines designed for a smooth, incoming current receive flows at an angle. The compressors cough with pops. This is not a failure. This is the wrong question for a working car. Why is that? The most important sound at such moments. Because where there's fire, there's a fire extinguisher. Where there's darkness, there's a flashlight. And where there's a stress checklist. Every aviation security guard is like a door in a hallway. If one is slammed shut, the next one should open. Today, one of the doors is silent, and this silence is louder than a siren. There is a system on the panel that is required to scream if the aircraft is not set up for takeoff as intended. She doesn't scream, and while the cabin freezes and a lane astern turns into a rapidly decreasing ruler, the only correct strategy remains in the cabin. Let go of the nose, give the speed a chance, give the wing what it asks for, a dense stream. But seconds are like small coins. They cannot be exchanged for minutes when the touch of the antennas is already in the windshield. The heat, which should have remained only inside the combustion chambers, breaks out. Fuel likes order, sparks like chaos. Their meeting is always short and bright. The design, designed for multiple cycles, is faced with overloads, which are shown in the textbooks as a red zone. The aircraft breaks down in weak spots, where engineers left technological seams so that they would never be useful. And all this is a consequence of a chain where every element looked like a trifle. The conversation was out of place, the item will have time later, the answer like last time, the habit of closing your eyes and seeing what should be, not what is. The juxtaposition is cruel and honest. Iron and regulations against human memory and pace. When aviation is perfect, it's boring. When it gets interesting, it's too late. But the truth is, this story didn't have to be told. It didn't have to happen. In aviation, there is rarely a single culprit. Usually it is a whole ensemble of minor dissonances, and if at least one instrument had played on time, The music would have remained the usual morning jazz of taxiing, briefing, and acceleration. We will analyze why the orchestra broke into a false note and how one inaudible system turned the last chance into silence. To understand why everything went wrong, let's go back an hour to the clear skies of Dallas. The morning over Dallas began with rare precision. The sky was clear to the horizon, as if washed. The air is warm, but not yet hot. The wind is light. The runways are shiny after the night dew. It's a gift for the crews. No thunderstorm activity, no gusts, no surprises. On days like these, flying is almost a formality. It's a little after 8 o'clock. It's a busy morning at Dallas, Fort Worth Airport, with dozens of planes lining up like a silver column towards the southbound lanes. Among them is a Boeing 727 flying the flag of Delta Airlines, Flight 1141, bound for Salt Lake City. The flight is short, 2.5 hours. Passengers sit down calmly, without haste. Someone flips through the newspaper, someone checks the photo on the film. After all, it's 1988, the world still believes in an analog. Families are returning from vacations. Men in business suits are taking out notebooks to outline meetings. Students are discussing their universities. Everything sounds familiar, as if the world can't throw up anything new. The cabin is filled with morning light streaming through the oval portholes. In the kitchen, the flight attendants check the coffee and close the cupboards. The captain's voice over the speakerphone sounds confident and without a trace of excitement. Welcome aboard Delta Flight 1141 to Salt Lake City. Travel time is 2 hours and 30 minutes. The weather along the route is clear. No one knows that in an hour this voice will be repeated on the decryption of the black box. The aircraft is a Boeing 727, a legend of its time. Reliable, hardy, with 3 engines, one of which is hidden in the tail as a spare respiratory organ. It's not new anymore. 14 years in the sky, tens of thousands of flight hours. But for aircraft technology, this is maturity, not old age. Everything is working as it should, almost everything, except for one faulty fuel indicator. In the reports, this is listed as a minor malfunction. In technical jargon, it is a MEL item, an item from the permitted list of malfunctions that the aircraft can still fly with. In aviation, such things don't scare you. Backup devices, backup systems, insurance on insurance. If someone could have looked under the panel then, they would have seen kilometers of wires neatly wound into bundles and tied with ribbons, like the nerves of a living organism. Everything breathes engineering logic. There is predictability in every detail. But even an ideal organism can harbor an invisible disease, one that will not wake up immediately, but when it is too easy to awaken it. On the platform, the equipment rolls the ladder away from the side, the mechanics close the hatches, and the tow truck is ready to hook the front landing gear. Everything is going according to the script in the control room. The commander receives a flight plan, direct to Salt Lake, flight level 330, route clear. A signature, a stamp, a short exchange of phrases with the dispatcher, politely, almost casually. The cabin smells like a mixture of kerosene, rubber, and coffee. Captain Larry Davis, a tall, confident man of 48, occupies the left-hand seat. I've got 20 years in Delta and more than 17,000 hours in the sky behind me. He come from that pilot school where everything is decided not by instruction, but by experience. I know, I saw, I did. Next to him is the first officer, Kerry Wilson Kirkland, or simply Wilson. 37 years, 9 years in the company, 6,500 flight hours. Until recently, he was an engineer on the same 727s. Now he is the co-pilot. Their duo is a well-worked team, trust without words. Behind them is a young flight engineer, Stephen Judd, a former naval aviator. Only 7 months at Delta, but already 3,000 hours of experience. He is responsible for the systems, electricity, fuel, pressure. His remote control looks like an organ, dozens of switches, light bulbs, indicators. One look, and he knows how the heart of the plane is beating. All three had a good night's sleep, they were on duty without delay, and the psychophysiological background was clean. This is how most incident reports begin, with ideal conditions. It's as if nature itself wants to emphasize that it's not about a storm or a malfunction, but about how easily a person can go blind from routine. A trailer appears outside the window. It's time. The crew completes pre-flight checks. Pressure control, alignment, exhaust temperature, generator voltage. Everything is stable. Everything is normal. The item fuel sensor is defective, but within tolerance, flashes in the checklist. The captain nods, and the flight engineer confirms that it is safe to fly. And really, what to be afraid of? 3 JT-8D engines under the tail are like 3 guarantees of reliability. But where engineers have provided a reserve, a person creates an exception. One electrical contact, hidden deep in the system, has already begun to corrode. It is not visible. It does not affect either the launch or the taxiway. But it is through him that the signal from one of the most important defenders of the aircraft passes. The one who should warn if the car is not ready for takeoff. And while the sun's rays fall on the metal skin and the stewardess habitually closes the door, this silent defect remains on board. Inconspicuous, quiet, perfect in his anticipation of the moment. It will work exactly when it is most needed, and that's when it won't work. The cabin of a Boeing 727 is not just a space. It is a three-dimensional organism where each organ knows its place. On the left is the captain, the commander of the aircraft. He is responsible not only for the flight, but also for the philosophy of flight itself, how the crew thinks, reacts, and distributes attention. On the right is the first officer, his eyes and hands in a mirror, the one who duplicates every movement and every thought. Behind them, facing a panel with 100 switches, is a flight engineer. His world is electricity, hydraulics, and pneumatics, invisible to passengers, but vital. Everything that happens here happens in the us format. No one acts alone. Every voice has weight, but the commander is the conductor. Larry Davis has this conducting gesture, confident, calm, without pressure. Over the past 20 years, he has become accustomed to the rhythm of flights, where day is like day. Filing, launching, taxiing, takeoff, flight level. He knows that the quieter the cabin, the more reliable the car is. But silence can be different. Sometimes it's control, and sometimes it's self-confidence. The first officer, Kerry Wilson Kirkland, at Delta knew almost everyone by name. His colleagues called him Wilson, without a title, because he was one of those who remained friendly even under pressure. He was joking. He knew when to soften the situation and when it was worth just keeping quiet. 9 years at the company had made him not just a pilot, but part of Delta's culture, one where everyone considered themselves a bit of a captain. It was a strength and a weakness. The third in the crew was Stephen Judd, the youngest, but the most attentive. Its control panel is like a separate plane in an airplane. He oversees fuel pumps, air conditioning systems, and electrics. Every arrow is like a pulse for him. His experience in naval aviation has made him meticulous to the smallest detail. But he is new to the company, and next to 2 senior colleagues, his caution sounds like a polite pause, not like confidence. When the tow truck pulls the plane away from the gate, the 3 pilots have everything scheduled. Starting engine number 1, then 2, then 3. Control of oil pressure, vibrations, exhaust temperature. But the atmosphere in the cabin is not tense, but conversational. While the compressors are unwinding, Davis is interested. Did you get your checks? Wilson nods, laughs, yes, last night. Talking about salaries against the background of the hum of turbines sounds almost surreal, but this is everyday life. Pilots are also people with mortgages and payment schedules. From this moment on, according to the rules, there should be a sterile silence, the so-called sterile cockpit rule. From the moment the engines are started until reaching an altitude of 10,000 feet, the crew has no right to discuss anything other than flight. No salary, no dinner, no politics. Because it is these minutes that are the most intense in terms of workload. Every sound, every signal, every decision can be the one that separates normal from extreme. But Davis, Kirkland, and Judd are old school. The 80s were a time when aviation already knew that discipline saves, but it had not yet had time to get used to the fact that relaxation kills. They are calm. The plane rolls towards the taxiway. In the headphones, negotiations with the dispatcher, short, honed phrases. Ground Delta 1141, ready to taxi, inner route to 18 left. The answer is, Roger, Delta, follow traffic ahead. Everything is going perfectly. The engines are whispering smoothly, like a metronome. The thrust is distributed symmetrically. The instruments are consistently green. Judd closes the protective covers on the toggle switches, locks the systems in their working position. At this point, the captain makes a decision to save fuel. He turns off the right engine, number 3. This is acceptable, even welcome. Why burn kerosene while standing in line? That's what everyone does. Delta, Pan AM, and United. The cabin changes the vibration slightly. The asymmetry is audible only to those who know what to look for. On paper, this is a common procedure. In fact, it is the first invisible brick in the wall of a future catastrophe. Because when the system is turned off, it ceases to be a system. And in the multi-level architecture of the 727, everything is connected. Air conditioning, electricity, sensors. Everything breathes from a common network. While the tractor is unhooking, the captain checks the altimeter and reads out the taxiway checklist. His voice is flat, almost lazy. Wilson responds with the usual phrases: set, checked, normal. But there is one detail. It is not the commander who initiates the checklist, but the co-pilot. It's a small thing, but in aviation, it's the small things that make up the chain. A commander should lead, not follow. But on this flight, the roles seem to blur. This cabin is a mirror of Delta itself of those years. A system where pilots fly according to their habits, not according to the standard. After the FAA audit, the company already knew that discipline in the cabins was lame. Each crew creates its own micro-rules. The commander is the boss, and if he lets you relax a little, no one objects. The taxiway stretches. The queue is slowly creeping towards the lane. Other planes are taking off in the sky. Their roar is reflected in the glass. At this time, inside the cabin, instead of instructions, there are jokes about the weather, the long line, and the fact that we'll wait until the beards grow. Laughter is useful for stress relief, but it is dangerous when it replaces attention. A few minutes later, a flight attendant looks in the door. She has been with Delta for 30 years. Her face is calm and experienced. She asks when they take off. Passengers are asking. They are nervous. A conversation starts easily, like in a living room, not in a cabin. Wilson jokes, discusses the upcoming elections. Coffee, jokes about colleagues. Everything sounds lively, and all the while the plane is moving. It's against the rules, but no one notices. As a rule, they disappear into the warmth of the conversation. A phrase uttered in a low voice will become prophetic. Let's at least talk about something interesting so that the investigators can have something to listen to on the recorder if something happens. Wilson laughs. No one pays attention. A joke, they say, is always. The captain answers about past accidents, compares cases, and smiles. Nothing alarming, just chatter between experienced people. But an invisible crack is already beginning to form under this lightness. The cabin is not a place for casual words. Here, every second is either preparing for takeoff or hindering it. And the moment human warmth enters the door, discipline comes out of the cabin. The plane continues to taxi. The queue is shrinking. There are still uncrossed items on the checklists, but there is still time. It seems there is. So far, No one knows that minutes spent talking will soon turn into seconds that won't be enough. When the plane starts moving, it's like an internal switch is flipped by the crew. The sound of the turbines changes character, the air under the cabin trembles, and all attention should be narrowed to one thing: rudders, thrust, checklists, dispatcher. At these moments, talking about life becomes something like a cigarette near the gas tank. It seems like a small thing until it flares up. This is exactly what aviation has one of the simplest and yet most stringent rules for: a sterile cabin. This is not a metaphor. This is a legal requirement. In the 1970s, after a series of disasters involving crew distractions, the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration introduced this standard for all commercial flights. Its meaning is simple. From starting the engines to an altitude of 10,000 feet, pilots have no right to discuss anything other than flight. No politics, no weather, no dinner, no salaries. Because statistics have shown that disasters were most often born not from breakdowns, but from phrases like, "Did you watch the match yesterday?" This rule has saved hundreds of lives. Its purpose is not to silence, but to narrow the field of attention. When you control a car that weighs more than 80 tons and moves at a speed of 250 kilometers per hour on Earth, the brain should be completely here. Any deviation, and you no longer notice that the device did not react, or the light bulb did not light up, or the lever did not move. But in the morning cabin of Delta Flight 1141, this rule turns into a formality. Everything looks calm. Everything is under control, and therefore sterility seems to be an unnecessary strictness. Commander Larry Davis is confident that as long as the plane is traveling slowly, there are no risks. He himself lived through an era when pilots behaved in the sky like ship captains, with character, jokes, and confidence that technology was created to obey humans and not the other way around. First Officer Wilson Kirkland, younger, but from the same background. He respects the commander, trusts the experience, and if the commander smiles, it means everything is going well. Therefore, when a flight attendant enters the cabin and the conversation returns to salaries and politics, no one sees anything wrong with that. It's not critical as long as we're crawling, Davis says, watching the wings of the planes ahead of the cube glisten in the sun. At one point, flight engineer Stephen Judd, the most taciturn of the three, nevertheless reminds, "We haven't finished the taxi checklist yet." But the captain answers not with words, but with a slight nod, saying, "Don't rush." This is a strange moment. Theoretically, a commander should be the one who demands precision, not the one who delays it. As the plane rolls down the taxiway, negotiations are heard on the air. The dispatcher's frequency is like a chorus of dozens of voices, all compressed into short orders and confirmations. Every word must be heard, but in this cabin, the noise of human conversations is gradually drowning out the radio broadcast. "Did you remember to change the frequency?" the captain finally asks. "Oh, that's right, I've been hanging around," Wilson replies and switches on the radio station. A small pause, a light laugh, and no one perceives it as an alarm signal. But it is precisely in such small things that aviation begins to lose its stability. A mistake in the cockpit rarely looks like a disaster. It looks like comfort. Against the background of calmness, the conversation flows nowhere. About birds outside the window, about the weather, about the news. Someone jokes, "I wonder what the investigators will say if we crash." Laughter, absurd but sincere. At that moment, no one feels that these words will be recorded by a dictaphone built into the cockpit, and that one day they will be listened to by investigators wearing headphones, trying to figure out exactly where everything went wrong. Meanwhile, the dispatcher reports that the plane is the fourth in line for takeoff. This usually means 10 to 15 minutes of waiting. Judd, without waiting for a command, informs the cabin, "We are number 4 for takeoff. Please fasten your seatbelt." He does it himself, although according to the instructions he had to wait for the captain's order. One more little thing. Another touch to the overall picture of relaxation. Every minute of taxiing turns into a waiting ritual. The horizontal stabilizer has already been installed, the avionics have been checked, and the engine parameters are stable. All that remains is not to forget one thing: to set the flaps to the 15 degrees position. This is a mandatory procedure before takeoff. But no one read the checklist to the end. While the crew is chatting, automation is working somewhere inside the aircraft. Electrical circuits record every action: when the pump was turned on, when the valve was opened, when the lever was moved. One circuit is waiting for a signal from the throttles. It is through it that the warning system for incorrect takeoff configuration is triggered. She's ready to scream if something's wrong, but the contacts through which she listens have already slightly oxidized. She's still silent, for no reason yet. If it were possible to look into the future, then probably at this moment one of them would simply say, "Guys, let's go over the checklist again," without talking. But time only moves in one direction, and there is no repeat taxiing button in aviation. This silence between the checklist items is the first invisible crack. Everything is perfect outside: temperature, pressure, traffic, wind. But inside, everything is filled with things that shouldn't be in the sky. The habit of considering what only seems safe as the norm. And the longer the plane crawls towards the runway, the stronger this feeling becomes. Discipline dissolves into laughter, and confidence into complacency. But one forgotten lever is enough for all this calmness to be replaced by a roar of metal and a blinding flash of flame. The line to the strip stretched out like morning traffic on the highway. The plane rolls slowly along the taxiway. Outside, there is the hum of the jet engines of neighboring cars. The heat from the asphalt trembles in the air. Everything looks familiar. At such moments, pilots have a special sense of time, stretched, viscous, as if the clock inside the cockpit is running slower than outside. Captain Larry Davis decides to save fuel. The practice is common, even fashionable by the standards of the 80s. One engine turns off during prolonged taxiing to reduce fuel consumption. He turns the switch and turns off the right engine, number 3. The machine slightly changes the sound. The vibrations become asymmetrical. An experienced pilot captures this feeling in his gut, but otherwise everything is normal. "Let's give number 3 a break," Davis says. "I agree," Wilson says, nodding. The thrust drops slightly, but the 2 remaining engines are enough to keep moving. Now the plane is crawling even slower, but no one is in a hurry. There's a long queue ahead. The passengers behind the wall start yawning. The children turn their heads to the window, and a lazy calmness is felt more and more in the cabin. "It looks like we're going to wait forever," Kirkland says, reaching for a cup of coffee. "If they see us," Davis smiles. "Hey, Tower, look down at Delta while we're still young." Laughter. Even a flight engineer, usually reserved, smiles. On paper, it's just a moment of relaxation. In practice, this is the beginning of blurring the boundaries. When all 3 of them start joking, responsibility becomes collective, which means it's nobody's fault. Technical procedures are continuing at this time, but there are conversations between them. Kirkland opens the radio channel and requests permission to taxi further. The dispatcher responds dryly. Delta 1141 continued driving on the inner taxiway until 18 left. Everything is standard, but for some reason, the captain does not initiate the following items on the checklist. The initiative goes down the hierarchy to the flight engineer. "Taxi checklist," Judd reminds me. Yes, let's get started," Kirkland replies. "The speeds are set," reads the engineer. "Checked," the first officer replies. "The altimeter is set." "Checked." The voices sound mechanical, as if it's a ritual rather than a process. Each item is marked without visual confirmation, just from memory. It's like checking a box in your head without checking if the door is closed. And suddenly the door really opens. Jane, a stewardess with 20 years of experience, enters the cabin. She leans confidently against the partition, her voice soft but insistent. "Gentlemen, the passengers are asking why we are standing. When do we take off?" Wilson turns around and smiles. "As soon as they remember us. Today, it's not us, but Taxiway, who is the captain of this flight." The conversation turns into light chatter. About the weather, about the coffee machine, about the upcoming elections. Everything is off topic, everything is outside the rules, but the atmosphere is friendly. No one feels anxious. Even as the plane begins to move slowly forward, they continue to talk, as if unaware that they are going through one of the most critical stages of the flight. Somewhere in the background, Judd is still monitoring the instruments. His hands automatically check the readings on the panel. Temperature, pressure, fuel, everything is in the green zones. He sees that the procedure is not going according to the template, but does not interfere. For a young engineer, telling the captain, "Let's focus," is almost like challenging the law. The minutes drag on. The radio is silent. Passengers in the cabin notice that the plane is stationary. Someone thinks, "We're probably waiting for permission." No one knows that discipline and order are waiting for permission inside the cabin. By the way, do you remember that story about the flight to Chicago? The captain suddenly says, leaning back in his chair, "When did the DC-10 fail to gain altitude?" "I remember," Kirkland nods. "Was there a problem with the engine then?" "Yes, the engine or the pilots," Davis grins. "In such cases, it's the same thing." An awkward silence. An irony that will become almost literal in half an hour. At this point, they should switch to the frequency of the next dispatcher, but the conversation takes their attention away. The radio is still on the old frequency. When Davis finally notices, he speaks calmly. "Have we changed the frequency?" Kirkland turns on the switch. Jane asked. He laughs, but there's a habit of impunity in that laugh. The plane finally stops at the runway. 3 sides remain in front of them. The sun rises higher. The light hits the instrument windows. Kirkland squints, takes out his sunglasses. Judd opens the list for the pre-flight briefing. This document is not just a formality. He describes exactly how they will take off. Wind direction, emergency lane, departure heights, possible malfunctions. But none of the 3 start the discussion. "I think everything is standard," says the captain. Dallas is like Dallas. The briefing remains unfulfilled. On paper, this is one of the most important points before takeoff. In practice, it's just another tick put down out of habit. The world inside the cabin begins to resemble a slow-motion symphony. Everything looks perfect, but every note sounds almost in time. It is at such moments that disasters arise not loudly, but almost beautifully, in warm sunlight, in a cabin where coffee smells, and where 3 professionals sincerely believe that everything is under control. They just don't know yet that the controls have already gone away, quietly, like an engine turned off. The plane continues to slowly creep up to the beginning of the runway, like a huge steel turtle that is in a hurry, but not in a hurry. There is a relaxed silence in the cockpit, punctuated by short phrases that have nothing to do with the flight. 3 people, 3 sets of responsibilities, 3 different experiences, and no single center of gravity. On paper, everything is simple. The commander is responsible for general management. The first officer is responsible for monitoring procedures, and the flight engineer is responsible for technical support. But in reality, everything got mixed up. The captain assigns the checks to the juniors. The flight engineer takes the initiative. The first officer executes the commands without waiting for confirmation. It's like an orchestra without a conductor. The music is playing, but every second is a risk of a false note. This management style did not come out of nowhere. Delta had a special culture in those years, respectful but overly liberal. The commanders had almost absolute autonomy. They could interpret the procedures at their discretion. After several high-profile incidents, the Federal Aviation Administration has already noticed that Delta has a lack of standardization in the cockpit. In other words, each crew play by their own internal rules. On paper, it looked noble, trust, and professionalism. In fact, it's chaos disguised as experience. Davis is a veteran. Wilson is a confident co-pilot. Judd is a young but disciplined engineer. It would seem that the ideal composition. But it was this combination that created the trap, when everyone believes that the others will not let them make a mistake. In psychology, this is called diffusion of responsibility. When all three of them are responsible for everything, no one is really responsible for anything in particular. Davis trusts Kirkland to check the configuration himself. Kirkland is confident that the engineer will fix the deviations. Judd thinks the captain sees everything. As a result, control turns into a chain of assumptions. And if someone were to ask now, are the flaps installed? Everyone would answer confidently, yes, of course. After all, they are confident in the system, in themselves, and in their experience. And this is the most insidious certainty, when you don't check because you don't doubt. The security system is built to eliminate the human factor, but a person will always find a way to bring it back. It's like building a wall and leaving a door in it just for your own. The flight engineer looks at the panel. Everything is green, everything is smooth. But now he doesn't see what isn't highlighted. No indicator will show that the flaps are still retracted. This point had to be confirmed with words and a glance. Two human steps that have now been replaced by automatism. Kirkland continues to have a conversation with the flight attendant, laughs, retells the joke, and then suddenly remembers the manager. Is it time for us to switch to the tower? Yes, do it, says the captain without looking. The hands move quickly and confidently, but everything is done on the autopilot of the human brain. It's like they're already mentally in the air, even though they're still on the ground. At such moments, aviation is like a game of chess, where each piece is sure that it knows where it is going, but no one checks whether it is standing at all on the board. Technical procedures are ongoing. Judd reads out the remaining items on the taxiing checklist. Kirkland answers automatically. The captain is silent. Everything is done, it seems. Not really. Several points were missed without visual inspection. It's unnoticeable, it's convenient, and it's dangerous. When the plane finally stops at the executive launch, the dispatcher unexpectedly calls them earlier than expected. Delta 1141, occupy the runway, wait for takeoff clearance. 3 pairs of eyes simultaneously rise from the instruments. Surprise. The queue suddenly disappeared. The time they were going to spend calmly completing the checks suddenly shrank into seconds. Now they need to finish 2 checklists at the same time, taxi and before takeoff. This is the moment when good crews take a break and ask the dispatcher for a few minutes. But Davis decides to go ahead. Okay, let's go right away. Everything is ready, he says. Done. This word sounds confident, but there is no verification in it. Kirkland and Judd, realizing that there is no time, rush to their tasks. The straps are secured. Flaps 15, 15, green light, Kirkland reads. But there is no green light. He doesn't even look at the indicator. He just says a familiar phrase that has been heard dozens of times before. This is the moment when habit wins over attention. He is sure that everything is up to standard. And standard is a word that loves error. Against the background of this hasty ritual, the captain checks the course and sets the trimmer. Everything looks familiar. The radio broadcast says, Delta 1141, get ready for takeoff. Follow the Boeing 737. The runway ahead is long and empty, like the beginning of a new day. No one thinks that the line between order and chaos is hidden behind this get ready. The plane is taxiing to the center line. The morning sun reflects off the compressor blades, blinding the cabin. Everything is perfect from the outside. The wind is fair, the temperature is comfortable, and the engine is ready to start. But inside, on the panel, in the silence of the systems, in the backstage of the electrical contacts, the stage is already set for drama. And if someone looked into the cockpit now, they would see an almost perfect picture. 3 pilots, confident, calm, collected. And if I had listened, I would have noticed the most dangerous thing: the silence where the test should have sounded. In a few seconds, the commander will apply thrust for takeoff. And then it turns out that their collective confidence didn't just let them down. She turned off the one voice that was supposed to stop them, the one who was supposed to say, "The plane is not ready to fly. The stripe is already in front of my eyes." Shimmering hot air falls on the concrete, like the surface of water, only instead of waves, dust is shaking, lifted by the jet stream of the previous aircraft. The cabin is filled with a slight tension, but it does not look like fear. Rather, it is like that habitual composure before the start, which experienced pilots turn into automatism. Delta 1141, cleared for takeoff, runway 18 left, is heard in the headphones. Permission to take off, a short phrase that starts everything, but there's still a sense of urgency inside the cabin. 2 procedures, taxi checklist and before takeoff checklist, are compressed into one breath. It's as if the surgeon decided to skip a couple of sterilization steps before the operation, because it's business as usual. Shoulder harnesses? The flight engineer asks. "They're on," Kirkland says, without taking his eyes off the controls. "Flaps 15 green." The voice sounds confident, but the indicator light is off. Flaps are not released. Why? Because 5 months ago, Delta changed the procedure for preparing for takeoff. Previously, the instructions required: release the flaps immediately after starting the engines. It was a clear, fixed moment when the hand was almost automatically reaching for the lever. But the new rule allowed this to be done at any time after undocking from the gate. The wording is vague, almost philosophical. After undocking. After that, when? In a minute? In 20 years? Already at the executive start? In this gray area between necessary and possible, logic is lost. And in the atmosphere of friendly relaxation, the procedure itself was lost. When the captain says, "ready for takeoff," no one specifies what exactly is ready. Everyone is sure of the rest. The human brain works sparingly at such moments. It doesn't look for problems if everything looks familiar. And now everything looks perfect. The plane is taxiing onto the runway. The sun hits the glass of the cabin, flooding the instruments with golden light. At this moment, Davis does not feel any danger, just a slight itch from the anticipation of flight, the very feeling for which pilots go to the sky. Is everything ready? "What is it?" he asks, more ritually. "Ready," Kirkland says. "Engine anti-ice?" "Closed." "Takeoff briefing?" "Completed." But there was no briefing at all. This is a short moment when the crew has to talk about how takeoff will take place, what to do in case of engine failure, what are the features of the runway, where to go in case of an emergency. Without him, flying is a game without a plan. However, they have flown from Dallas dozens of times. Everything is familiar, and the familiar is the enemy of attention. When a captain takes the helm, the cabin seems to be filled with electricity. This moment is the culmination of any shift. Thousands of hours of practice, hundreds of flights, dozens of checks, and now we're back in the air. It's simple. Apply thrust, wait for the speed V1, V2 separation. But today, there's a gap hidden between apply thrust and takeoff. Judd has a fleeting thought. Why didn't the air intake indicator light up? He knows that when setting takeoff power, the system itself must turn off the air supply to the air conditioning so that all the energy goes to thrust. But the air condominium off lamp did not light up. Strange. He notices this, but decides not to distract his colleagues. This is an important moment. It's better not to interfere. If he had known, this signal would have been the key to everything. The system had failed because the conditions for its activation had not been met. One of them is precisely the position of the throttles, which triggers a chain of sensors, including the takeoff configuration sensor, a system that should scream if the flaps are not installed. But she didn't scream, because the contact through which she listens to the position of the levers is slightly corroded. The signal didn't get through. The system does not know that the plane is about to take off. She thinks she's still taxiing. That's why he's silent. Set takeoff thrust, the captain says calmly. The levers go forward. Power set, confirms the first officer. The noise of the 3 engines covers the cabin. The Boeing 727 begins to take off. The acceleration is soft, heavy, like a wave that picks up and carries forward. The cabin vibrates slightly, and passengers feel pressure in their backs. Everything seems normal, but physics is indifferent to illusions. The wings of the 727 are designed for height and speed. The slim profile is ideal for cruising, but useless at low speeds. To compensate for this, engineers have come up with a system of flaps, wings that grow during takeoff. When the flaps are retracted, the aircraft must accelerate much faster to get off the ground. But now the wing remains bare. And although the engines are working perfectly, the plane is simply not able to take off on time. All this is invisible mathematics, working to the sound of turbines. No one in the cockpit realizes that the balance of power has already been disrupted. 80 knots, Kirkland says. Checked, the captain replies. V1 rotate. The captain smoothly pulls the steering wheel towards himself. The nose rises. Everything is as usual, but something is wrong. The sterns seem to stick to the ground. The nose goes up, the wheels stay in the lane, and only the tail begins to scratch the concrete, knocking out sparks. Davis pulls harder. The plane, resisting, finally takes off, but not skyward, but in desperation. The wing barely holds the air. The steering wheel vibrates. The stick shaker warns of the approaching disruption of the flow. If you don't let go of the nose now, don't let the plane gain speed, the aerodynamics will collapse. But Davis does the opposite. He pulls harder. The car starts to rock. The right wing loses lift, and the wing tip hits the runway, scattering sparks. There was a sharp bang and a scream in the cockpit. Kirkland sees a drop in thrust on the instruments and decides that the engine has failed. It's logical, too logical, but wrong. Everything can still be saved. One is only to let go of the nose, let the speed return. But a stressed person holds on to control like a handrail over a precipice. Engine failure? Kirkland shouts. No, Judd says, but it's too late. After a moment, the plane loses its balance. The ILS antennas are in front of the crew's eyes. Pull up. I'm trying. 3 voices, 3 different intonations. Confidence, panic, instinct. And here it is, the point of no return. The wing catches the antenna. The sparks turn into flames. The force of the impact destroys the right console. The fuel is thrown out, ignites from the turbine heat. The plane falls to the ground, slides, breaks, crumbles like a toy too fragile for its own mass. 24 seconds. And all because of one lever that no one touched. And because of one signal that no one heard. And because there was a gray gap between according to the rules and as usual, which neither technology nor attention could fit into. When Captain Davis applied takeoff thrust, the last sound that no one heard was supposed to be the alarming long, drawn beep, the cry of the warning system about the incorrect takeoff configuration. This is the last guardian that stands between human error and disaster. His task is simple. If the plane is not ready for takeoff, the flaps are not set, the brakes are on, the stabilizer is in the wrong position, the system should scream. Without the right to doubt, without the right to silence. But in the cockpit of Flight 1141, the system is silent. Complete, indifferent silence. And this silence sounds louder than any alarm. For the crew, it's a sign that everything is in order. After all, if something was wrong, he would have screamed, wouldn't he? In aviation, silence is perceived as consent. The system is not complaining, so everything is fine. But today, silence is not a sign of peace, but the result of a small, unnoticeable illness in the electrical wiring. The contact in the circuit connecting the throttle levers to the configuration sensor was corroded. Because of this, the electrical signal that was supposed to say, engines at takeoff power, check the flaps did not reach. For the system, the plane was still crawling on the taxiway. And if that's the case, there's no need to shout. This mistake is small, almost invisible. But in aviation, minor failures don't live alone. They're always waiting for company. When the 727 began to take off, flight engineer Judd actually noticed that one lamp on the panel did not light up. The one that indicated that the air conditioning system was turned off and all air pressure was directed at the engines. This should have happened automatically when takeoff thrust was reached. But the lamp remained dark. He frowned, looked again, and everything else was stable. The pressure is within the normal range, and the temperature is too. So, everything is fine. This is not the time to distract the captain. It is in these fractions of seconds between noticed and said that disaster is always placed. While the plane was picking up speed, everything looked normal. An instant illusion of security. No vibrations, no deviations. Just the familiar hum of the three JT-8D engines, steady and strong. For the passengers, all this was the usual start of the flight. Even the sound of a tail touch would be mistaken by many for a slight bump. But for aerodynamics, the impossible was happening now. The plane was trying to take off with a wing that couldn't fly at that speed. Without the flaps released, the lift was too low. The wing, designed for a thin stream of air at an altitude of 10 kilometers, beats helplessly in the thick, dense air near the ground. As the nose began to rise, the tail grated against the concrete. This sound, a mixture of screeching and rumbling, went through the entire fuselage. The passengers in the back rows screamed. There was a brief shock in the cabin. Tail strike. Someone shouted, but the captain does not react. He's already pulling the wheel further. At an altitude of only 20 feet, the plane begins to shake. The vibration turns into shaking. At this time, the stick shaker, a mechanical vibrator on the control column, is triggered, warning of an approaching flow disruption. The steering wheel is shaking like it's alive, as if it's shouting, "Put your nose down." But the picture in Davis's head is completely different. He feels that there's not enough traction. On the instruments, the N1 indicators are falling turbine speeds. So the problem is with the engines, he decides. Not on the wings, not in aerodynamics. This is one of the most common traps of human perception, when the brain replaces the reason with something that seems familiar. Kirkland confirms. The thrust is falling. The right engine? No, it's holding up, Judd says, looking at the instruments. All three are stable, but by ear, by instinct, by body sensation, it seems that something is wrong. Davis holds the steering wheel with two hands, raises the nose even higher, trying to pull the plane out of the ground by force. The wing is losing flow. The air comes off. The lifting force is collapsing. The plane is shaking. At an altitude of 100 feet, a slight roll to the right. The tip of the wing touches the stripe and draws a long, dazzling line of sparks along it. The passengers are screaming. There is a short pause in the cabin. Three people are in shock, but everyone has their own version of what is happening in their head. No one says the word flaps. When the car comes off again, it barely stays in the air. The 727 is flying with a minimum margin of speed, staggering like a heavy bird that has lost its feather. "We're losing it, Larry," Kirkland shouts. I got it," the captain answers and pulls the wheel even harder. But now it's not management anymore. It's a fight against physics, which is no longer on their side. In front are ILS antennas, thin metal masts as tall as a house. Kirkland opens the microphone, tries to say something to the dispatcher, but does not have time. The right wing touches the first antenna. Flash. The metal is tearing. Flame. A moment later, the fuel tank of the right wing breaks through, and the flaming jet goes back under the skin. The plane falls to the ground at an angle, turns over, breaks in half. Only 24 seconds from the moment of separation to impact. And all this time, the very system created to scream has not made a sound. She was the last barrier between the crew and disaster. The barrier that was supposed to speak. But he chose silence. This means that metal, wires, and black boxes will now have to speak. When everything subsides, the sound, the fire, the screams, another noise begins. The one that the ears can't hear, but the magnetic tape can. A day after the disaster, NTSB engineers lift 2 black boxes from the wreckage. One is FDR, Flight Data Recorder, stores thousands of parameters, speed, pressure, lever position. The second one is the CVR, Cockpit Voice Recorder, which remembers everything that happened in the cabin. Every word, every switch click, every breath. When the specialists turn on the CVR recording, the room becomes unusually quiet. At first, the usual sounds, starting engines, short jokes, discussing the weather. Then there are conversations that shouldn't have been heard during taxiing. The sterile cabin seemed to dissolve into friendly laughter. The sound of brakes, the creak of seats, then Kirkland's phrase. "We'll have to say something interesting if they listen to the recorder after the accident." Laughter, then silence. Then, the crackle of the microphone, background noise of acceleration, heavy breathing. V1, rotate, kick, screams. And at the end, there's a short, choppy signal, as if the film itself doesn't want to play it back. The silence after the disaster is not silence, but investigation. From the FDR data, the engineers see everything clearly. The flaps were retracted. The warning system has not been activated. On takeoff, the air intake shut-off lamp did not light up. Each parameter converges into a single picture. No mysticism, no coincidence. Everything is understandable. But explicable does not mean excusable. The NTSB records. The malfunction of the warning system is caused by corrosion of the electrical contact in the throttle lever sensor block. In engineering language, this sounds emotionless. In human, it means the signal did not reach. However, the investigation does not stop there. After all, even with a faulty signal, the crew should have noticed that the flaps were not exposed. Why didn't you notice? Because I didn't check it. Why didn't you check it? Because there are conversations. Why talk? Because discipline in the cockpit has long since given way to habit. The report indicates a different type of failure. Not technical, but behavioral. In their findings, the investigators cite the results of an FAA audit of Delta Airlines conducted a year before the disaster. It was already noted at the time. The captains of the company exhibit individual management styles, which leads to inconsistencies in the actions of the crews. In the language of investigations, this means one thing. Every commander is his own law. In the Flight 1141 report, the NTSB clearly states, violation of the principle of a sterile cabin, errors in the distribution of responsibilities, and insufficient coordination of the crew were the key factors leading to the disaster. The technique failed, yes, but technology is the last line of defense. It turns on when everything else has already collapsed. After this disaster, the FAA issues a directive. Check all Boeing 727s in service for the correct operation of the takeoff warning system. Almost 1,200 aircraft worldwide are undergoing extraordinary inspections. The result amazes even engineers. Similar anomalies were found in 35 aircraft, and in 12 cases, exactly the same contact corrosion as in the Delta 1141. For Boeing, this is a serious blow to its reputation, but for the FAA, it is a signal that safety cannot be considered established. A new rule is being introduced. The signal to trigger the warning system should not come from the position of the levers, but from the actual power of the engines. Now, if the craving has increased, the system must speak. Always, without the right to doubt. In addition, a requirement is being introduced for all airlines. A health check of the warning system every 200 flight hours. But engineers know that technology is only half the equation. The other half are people. After Delta 1141, a rethink of what discipline begins in the pilot environment. Dry checklists turn into a living system where every word, every confirmation makes sense. Simulators are starting to simulate not just engine failures, but failures. Interactions. Scenarios where the commander makes mistakes and the first officer has to object. Where the flight engineer is obligated to intervene, even if it is inconvenient. There is a new direction in training, crew resource management, CRM. His goal is not only to distribute tasks, but also to give each crew member the right to influence safety, regardless of rank. Now, if the captain is distracted by conversation, the co-pilot has every right to remind, "Sir, the cabin is sterile," and no one would consider it an impertinence. This is not just a reform, it is a change of philosophy. From a vertical hierarchy, the cabin becomes a team where the voice of the youngest can save the elder. Over the years, this culture will evolve into new technologies. Electronic checklists, automatic confirmation of items, mutual blocking of systems if something is not set. Modern airplanes will not allow the pilot to say ready until everything is ready on board. But these innovations are a legacy bought at the price of the mistakes of those who believe that experience protects better than rules. In the NTSB report, the last line is dry, but terribly accurate. The crew failed to ensure proper control over the implementation of standard procedures, which led to the aircraft taking off in an incorrect configuration. And if you listen to the CVR recording to the end, the last seconds sound almost symbolic. The hum of the engines is still audible. Then a scream, then a blow, and then silence again, the very silence that started all. After the engineers had collected the metal fragments in the hangar and deciphered the tapes, it was time to figure out not what had happened, but why people had allowed it to happen. They don't like such words and reports, but the truth is that the crash of Delta Flight 1141 was not caused by technology, but by confidence. That quiet, comfortable confidence that makes experienced pilots believe that everything is under control. The human factor is a term that today sounds almost like a separate science. But in 1988, it was a new concept. After decades of disasters, it became clear that most tragedies did not start in mechanisms, but in heads. Somewhere they didn't say, somewhere they didn't check, somewhere they were too shy to remind the commander that he was wrong. At Delta, the problem was systemic. Commanders were used to being the absolute masters of their cabins. The hierarchy was indisputable. The captain was talking, and the others were listening. In those days, the expression crew coordination sounded beautiful on paper, but rarely translated into reality. When a pilot with 20 years of experience is sitting on the left, and a young engineer is next to him, not a single point on the checklist is able to equalize their voices. The NTSB describes it dryly: insufficient culture of mutual control in the cockpit. But there are dozens of psychological mechanisms behind this phrase. The effect of authority. The younger one is afraid to correct the older one. Habit effect. The captain relies on memory instead of observation. The group's illusion effect. Everyone is sure that someone else has checked everything. To understand how easily this works, it is enough to recall the sequence on the taxiway. The captain allowed conversations. The co-pilot supported them. The flight engineer said nothing. The entire control system crumbled, although none of them did anything wrong in terms of intentions. They all wanted a safe takeoff. They just didn't notice how they stopped thinking about it. After this accident, the FAA changed its approach to training. Pilots used to be taught how to drive cars. Now, they have begun to learn how to manage people, themselves, colleagues, and communication. This is how a new philosophy, crew resource management, CRM, was born. Her idea is simple. The plane is not controlled by a person, but by a team. Everyone has to speak out. Everyone has the right to stop the process if something seems wrong. The captain is not a king, but a coordinator. Simulators began to play scenarios where silence kills. The cadets learned not only to keep the course in altitude, but also to say stop. Situations were worked out when the first officer had to remind aloud, "Sterile cabin, stop talking." And the captain had to answer, "Accepted." It looked formal, but it's the formalities that save you when adrenaline prompts you to make the wrong decisions. After all, in the sky, the brain does not act by logic but by instinct. When stress goes through the roof, the memory of the rules is erased. That is why now each item on the checklist requires not just a verified response, but a specific confirmation. Looked, saw, confirmed. During the training sessions, they began to talk about how to respond to internal alarms. If the brain tells you something's wrong, you can't drown it out with a joke. Intuition is not the enemy of logic, but its early detector. Instructors introduce a new rule: assertiveness, perseverance, and safety. Even if you're a junior, you have the right to be persistent. If the captain is distracted, you must remind him. If you hear a discrepancy, speak up immediately. It's not an argument. It's a professional reflex. Psychologists who participated in the development of new programs notice an interesting paradox. The more confident a person is in their competence, the less they notice their own mistakes. Experience doesn't make mistakes, it makes you confident, and confidence without verification is smoke without fire, which smells like disaster. Delta 1141 became the case when the world saw for the first time. Even a perfectly technically sound aircraft can die due to incorrect conversation. A few years later, other airlines began to implement CRM in their training systems. These changes, which seemed like bureaucracy at the time, later saved hundreds of crews. In the modern sky, CRM is already built into every action. If the pilot stops talking, the second one reminds him. If the instrument does not deviate, the system reminds the pilot. If the pilot does not respond, the automation reacts. So, step by step, the human factor ceased to be an enemy and became an ally. But even with all these changes, the lesson of Flight 1141 has remained alive. Technology can fix a mistake, but cannot fix a habit. And if at least one person in the cockpit decides that the rule is for beginners, then all progress will again be on the strip where concrete meets metal. Delta 1141 wasn't just a tragedy. She became a mirror in which all aviation saw its weak spot, the human one. And I realized that real safety does not begin with the instruments, but from a moment when someone in the cockpit decides to say, "Wait a minute, let's check it again." After the investigation of Delta Flight 1141, aviation seemed to have moved into a new era, an era where people are no longer alone in the sky. Machines began not only to help, but to ensure that people did not deviate from the order. Where previously the responsibility lay entirely with the crew, now the aircraft itself has become an active participant in safety. In the 90s, engineers began to introduce electronic checklists into cabins, live documents embedded directly into the on-board computer. No more paper cards, lost pages, or pencil marks. Now the system knows what you did and what you didn't do. If the item is not completed, you can't just say done. The checklist will not let itself be deceived. Before takeoff, everything is now connected in chain. Sensors for flaps, stabilizer position, de-icing system, thrust, all send signals to a single module. And until each of them confirms normal, the takeoff button does not turn into a permission to act. Modern aircraft, such as the Boeing 787 or Airbus A350, go even further. They are literally talking to the crew. Their systems don't just show parameters, they evaluate the context. If the pilots forgot to set the flaps, the display does not just show flaps not set. It blocks the launch of the takeoff mode, simultaneously activates the audible and visual alarms. You can be tired, distracted, angry, or in love. The plane won't let you make a fatal mistake. And all this is a consequence of those very seconds on the strip in Dallas. Back in 1988, the system was silent. Today, she would have screamed. Not just a squeak, but the voice of a synthesized assistant. Configuration. Configuration. Check takeoff. Configuration. In aviation, it is now generally accepted that an error is not a crime, but a system signal. And if the system is silent, it's not just technology that's to blame, but a culture that doesn't know how to listen. After Delta 1141, the design philosophy itself changed. The designers of Boeing and Airbus began to think not as engineers, but as psychologists. They realized that under stress, a person doesn't remember, he reacts. Therefore, interfaces began to be built on the principle of don't think, see. The buttons and indicators were positioned so that the pilot's gaze always fell on the most important thing. The colors of the signals were standardized: red, immediate action; yellow, attention; blue, confirmation. Previously, the cockpit was a maze of light bulbs and levers. Now, it is a neural network of logic and priorities. Even sounds have become part of the language. Every tone, every melody has a specific meaning. Not just a signal, but a word in the safety dictionary. And all this because of one morning where a single squeak did not sound. Today, if the pilot does not set the flaps, check the stabilizer, or close the brakes, the plane will stop on its own. Automatic thrust limitation will not allow you to start a run-up. The system sees that the configuration does not match the takeoff and simply does not allow it to take off. This is the paradox of aviation. The more it becomes automated, the more it cares about people. Cars don't take power away from pilots. They give them back the confidence that now no one will be left alone with their mistake. But if everything has become more reliable in technology, then it is more difficult with human nature. A new generation of pilots has grown up in a world where the airplane fixes everything. They are less likely to make mistakes, but also less likely to learn from them. And engineers understand that it is impossible for a person to cease to be a part of the system. Therefore, in modern simulators, crews are forced to manually simulate old scenarios. Delta Flight 1141 is a mandatory element of training programs. Young pilots are shown how a quiet morning can turn into chaos because of an off-topic conversation. The instructor sets the CVR record. There's laughter in the headphones, a phrase about something interesting for investigators. Then the roar of engines, a scream, a crash, and silence. Then the instructor asks, "What would you do in their place?" The answer is always the same: "I would check the flaps." And then he asks the second question: "Would you check it if you didn't know it was important?" And this pause is the whole point of learning. Aviation is no longer fighting mistakes. It is fighting self-confidence. Every disaster leaves a scar, and new systems are built on it. Once it was done on steel, now it's in algorithms. The Boeing 787, for example, stores in memory all the deviation for the last hundreds of flights, analyzes them, and tells pilots trends. If someone forgets to check the item too often, the system itself will display a reminder. This is no longer just an airplane. This is a partner who knows a person's weaknesses and silently insures him against repeating someone else's mistake. And if Captain Davis could see what the cockpit looks like today, clean, automated, almost transparent, he would probably recognize himself in each of these systems. After all, they're all his invisible disciples. Now, every modern takeoff begins not only with the words, "Takeoff thrust set," but also with the unspoken promise contained in every electronic signal. We will not let you repeat their mistake. Every plane crash leaves behind more than just a footprint on concrete or debris in a landfill. It leaves an echo that stretches over decades, reflected in each new takeoff. Delta Flight 1141 has become one of those events that aviation does not forget about, even after more than 30 years have passed. Because it was a disaster, not because of a breakdown, not because of the weather, not because of an accident. It was a tragedy of human habit and a lesson that completely rewrote the approach to flight safety. After 1141, everything changed in aviation, from how pilots communicate to how airplanes are designed. Previously, security was based on engineering solutions, but now it has become a culture of thinking. A new realization has emerged. Mistakes are inevitable, but they cannot be left on a person's conscience alone. The system should be designed so that even if one of the elements fails, the others compensate. In this sense, Delta Flight 1141 became the starting point for a whole generation of changes that, by the 2000s, had transformed aviation into the safest form of transportation. But history loves rhymes. 20 years later, in August 2008, in Madrid, on the runway of Barajas Airport, a disaster occurred, similar to the mirror image of 1141. The Spanair flight JK 5022 also took off on a clear day, as it did then. And just like then, the flaps were not installed. The warning system, created to save, did not give a signal again. Contact corrosion, electrical circuit failure, almost the same thing. History repeated itself, and this time it claimed even more lives. The world was asking the same question again. Why? How can it be the same again after all the reforms, technologies, and inspections? The answer turned out to be philosophical. Technology doesn't age, but people do. New generations of pilots take to the skies without feeling the weight of past mistakes behind them. They're told about disasters in textbooks, but not as living stories, but as statistics. And over time, fear loses its edge, turning into a formality. That's why every disaster comes back with an echo, to remind you that safety is not achieved once. It's not a finish line, it's a process, an endless work on attention, on discipline, on not getting used to the miracle called flight. There is a quiet tradition in the aviation world even today. When the crew is preparing for departure and the first officer reads out the checklist, the last item before leaving the runway is often the phrase, "Takeoff configuration, checked and set." These two words, checked and set, sound simple, but there's a whole story behind them about how dearly aviation paid to be taken seriously. Delta Flight 1141 has become more than just an investigation. It has become a symbol of the end of an era. The era when an airplane was considered subordinate to a human. After him, a new one began, when man and machine became equal partners in management. After all, the moment Captain Larry Davis pulled the wheel, the sky was ready to receive them. It's always ready, but heaven expects respect, not habit. Now, every time an audible warning sounds in the cockpit, pilots no longer get annoyed. They're listening, because somewhere out there, in this artificial melody, in every squeak, in every signal, the memory of those who took off with the flaps removed and could not fix anything still lives. And if you listen carefully, you can hear a human echo behind all these electronic voices, automation, and dry procedures. It's not loud, but it's steady, like the pulse of aviation that never stops. An echo that tells every new crew, every new car, and everyone who sits at the window and believes that flying is routine. Safety does not start with technology. It starts from the moment you stop considering yourself infallible. This is the legacy of Delta 1141, a story that began with the silence of the system and ended with a loud reminder to the whole world. Silence in the cockpit should be discipline, not indifference.